And so in the 1950s, probably 1955, 1954, right after, there was a big exodus of Catholics from the north to the south. And most of the Catholics are actually in the north already. So this was about, they say it was about 750 to 800,000 Catholic Vietnamese that there was a big exodus from the north to the south of Vietnam, right? Because of the persecution of Catholics. And so my parents, so that was my grandparent generation that experienced that and fled to the south, okay? My parents, they met here in the United States, so they didn't know each other in Vietnam. And so my parents are fairly young. So my parents are in the early 60s, so you can see how old they were at that time. Here's a little map. My dad, he lived in Nha Trang, so like right here. So kind of right there. I know you probably can't see it. My mom, she lived in Vũng Tàu, which is right here. And then Saigon, which is now called Ho Chi Minh City, is the capital right there. But they live on the coastal area. I think about it now, my family, growing up, my family liked to go to Florida every summer. And now I think about it, why did we go to Florida so much? I'm thinking because my dad grew up on the coast. And so, I mean, he likes the ocean. It probably reminds him of home being on the coast. And actually, in a week, actually, my family are going to Florida again. But now thinking about it, yeah, they grew up on the coast. So, with that in mind, so with that history in mind of my family, of the persecution from the Communist Party of the North, and fleeing in the 1950s down to the south of Vietnam, then, you know, the war, you know, prolonged to about 1975. So the end of the war technically was April 30th, 1975. That was the fall of Saigon. And so there's many programs, PBS programs that talk about the war. There's many famous photos of the war, the end days. But what my parents told me was, right when Saigon fell, they knew they had to leave. So they knew they had to leave. My parents told me that it was kind of like, I think, I've heard in the past during the Cold War here in the United States, you know, you guys had drills for nuclear, like if there was a nuclear war, then what would happen, right? Or we have tornado drills in schools, right? So they have in their mind the drills of like, okay, if this were to happen, what you would take and what we would do and would leave. And so they kind of had that in mind as well. You know, I always asked them, what was it like to leave? And they said actually, they knew when they left with nothing. This is a kind of quote from my mom. She said, we left with nothing but our family and our faith in God. And that's why we fled. And they already knew, the Catholics already knew that there is no way of living with the Communist Party, right? And so, you know, I've read of stories of, you know, they'll take over Saigon and say, well, everything will be the same, right? And so people will fall for that, right? Because they were like, okay, everything will be the same, it'll be fine. But again, people who experienced the Communist Party already in the North already knew their lives and what would happen sooner or later. And so that's why in some ways, they had the courage to just leave, because there is no living in the way they could back in the south of Vietnam. And so my father's family was poorer than my mother's family. My grandfather was actually a carpenter, and like he was a carpenter in the sense that he built the boat they left on. Right? And so he built the boat they left on. And so the boat they left on was the boat that he built, and they fled. My father's family, I don't know how, but they fled as well on a different boat together. The fortunate thing is, at that time, in 1975, early on, American ships were still out there, right? So at the end of the war, there were still American ships. And so my family was fortunate enough that when they fled out there into the ocean, that they were soon later picked up by American ships, right? The difference between my mom's getting picked up and my dad being picked up is a little bit different, because my mom says, oh yeah, we were on like a nice battleship, and you know, the kids, as like little kids, my mom was like 12 at that time. She was like, oh yeah, we were watching movies, and you know, they gave us like M&Ms, and like, my dad's like, oh, we had none of that. But it was quite a horrific time. That there was a lot of chaos during that time, right? So my parents told me that, you know, even when they were fleeing the ships, the ships would come, and you know how they would transport from the smaller ship onto the American ships. They would put down this big metal flap, right, and that would connect the two ships together. But people were in such frantic chaos, you know, and they didn't know. They're like, maybe they're only going to take some of us, maybe not all of us. And so people will push. And so even during that time, maybe they weren't killed by the Communist Party, but they were killed by each other, of pushing each other off the ships, and things like that. I think it was on my mom's side, my uncle had enough foresight to say that we all stayed back, and so let everyone go first. Because it's either we all get on and we all go, or we'll all stay here together. And so, you know, people were asking me if I still have family in Vietnam, and actually all my family's here. Maybe there's very distant cousins of my father, but other than that, all of our family's here, because they made a point that if we all go together, we all don't go. During that time, that's not the case for every family. A lot of families split up. You know, a lot of kids and their parents got split up, things like that. There's other stories, you know, who were not fortunate enough to get picked up by American ships early on, who left later, maybe a few years later, late 70s. And this is where you got to get the term of boat people. You've heard of the term boat people. And there's horrific stories of boat people. Because during that time, that they're being stranded in the ocean on boats, right? They heard stories that the American ships were out there, that maybe we can get picked up, but that was early on. So here would be boat people who were fleeing to Malaysia, other neighboring countries, but they didn't want them either, right? Or there would be pirates, so people who take advantage of the situation that, who get on ships and then steal everything from the people, or sell them into like human trafficking things, right? Or you hear stories of boat people who were just died out in the ocean, right? There was perfect stories of that. My family was fortunate to leave right away. And I think it was because of the understanding of the past history, of generations of how the communists were. So, so once my family came in, they landed in, first place to land in was Guam, okay? They landed into Guam, and then the biggest refugee camp in the United States was in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, right? And so there was a big camp in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas where they would all stay. And then representatives from throughout the United States will come to sponsor different families into the States. My mentor priest, this is kind of neat. So I went to the University of Illinois at Chicago, and the priest, the Catholic priest there at the Student Center, he, in 1975, he finished college seminary, but he didn't know if he wanted to be a priest. So what did he do? He left the seminary and he worked with the resettlement of the Vietnamese people. And so he worked with the resettlement of the Vietnamese people in Chicago. And so he told me stories of, they would have to interview families. They had to interview families of like, what did you do? What did you do in Vietnam? Like, what work did you do? Well, most people are fishermen, right? They're agricultural, farmers or fishermen, things like that. And if you see the placement of where Vietnamese ended up, a lot of it is the Gulf Coast, Texas, most in California, right? Because the weather is kind of similar. But he told me that it was the faith of the Vietnamese people that brought him back into the seminary. He saw their faith and what they went through, and kind of God's movement in their life that made them go back in the seminary. So my family was Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, and they would be sponsored by different organizations. And so I think my mom's family was one of the last ones. So a lot of families would be sponsored, and they would be afraid. Again, there's a lot of fear there of will we be sponsored or not, or what would they do with us? So a lot of families would split up because there's like, oh, if you can sponsor my 2 kids, then go ahead and just go. My parents' family, again, they were big on we either get all sponsored together or we don't go at all. But who can sponsor like 40 people, right? So imagine like, there's different churches or organizations or families that would sponsor individuals. They can do that, right? And that would provide a home for them, help them get a job or schooling, things like that. So I know at the time, at the very end, the closing of the refugee camp, my mom's family was actually just sponsored by the what is now chicken company, Tyson Chicken Company. But it wasn't a good thing because it was kind of just for cheap labor. And so they stayed in Fort Chaffee doing that, but then sooner or later they were finally sponsored in by multiple families into the Kansas City area. And then my dad's family was sponsored by St. John Bosco's organization in Kansas City, Missouri. Okay? And so that's how they ended up coming into the United States, and that's how they ended up coming into Kansas City, Missouri. Later on,
can I ask you a question? How long were you in Guam?
How long
were they in Guam?
Oh, I wouldn't say very long. Maybe a month, maybe.
Well, that's too long.
Yeah. But they were maybe in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas for months, right? And so, but I think in the United States, that was the biggest resettlement program they ever had in the United States, was the resettlement of the Vietnamese people. My parents, again, my mom was 12 at that time. I think my dad was 15 at that time. And then they met here in Kansas City, Missouri in like high school or something like that. And then I was born here. And that's what Linda was saying, I'm American. I'm American. But with that in mind, it's not very clear. So technically, yes, I'm American. Also, technically, I'm like 100% Vietnamese blood, right? So this is where I'll talk about my own experience as a first generation born here in America, to give you a little glimpse into what that's like, because it's not any different. I say my experience is not any different than, say, any other culture, a Hispanic person who was born here but their parents came. Because again, there's a struggle that you have, and I find it is a struggle with your very identity. Because most of my life, so I grew up on the Missouri side, okay, and then we were fortunate to go on the Kansas side. And I grew up at Curé Bar's Catholic Church. But, so I went there during the school days, but on the weekend, for Sunday, we would go to the Vietnamese Catholic Church, which is on the Missouri side. And so in Kansas City, at that time when the resettlement of the Vietnamese people, there was kind of agreement between the two dioceses, the two bishops. So that's two dioceses, Kansas side, Missouri side. And diocese is a geographical area that they take care of, right? And so there was agreement that between, I believe, Bishop Bolin and I forgot the bishop of here, but there was agreement that the Kansas side would take care of the Korean community, the Korean Catholic community, and the Missouri side would take care of the Vietnamese Catholic community. And maybe one of the reasons why is they didn't want multiple communities to spring up in both sides, which would split up the communities, right? And so, yeah, so I grew up on the Kansas side, went to Catholic school there, but then on weekends we'll go to the Vietnamese Catholic Church, which is in all Vietnamese. And that's where my parents are today. They go to that church, right? But there is, for a first generation born, there's this kind of struggle with identity. And because you don't grow up the same, right? Your parents are holding on to what they know, right? And so this is a new land for them. But yet when you're going to school, like for instance, I think my parents told me I was pretty fluent in Vietnamese up until I was like 3 or 4, right? That's all I knew. But then when I went to school, then my English was much, much better because I'm using it more, right? And so most of my life, I would say there was always this struggle with identity of who am I? Am I American or am I Vietnamese? Am I American or Vietnamese? And even what we do, again, I would go to Vietnamese Catholic Church and I would go to the American Catholic Church. And so there was always a struggle of who am I? And I think with anyone who grows up like that, you kind of try on both things. At some part of your life, you identify with one or the other, and you reject the other. Early on, you identify as, oh, I'm Vietnamese. But when I go to school, I realize I'm the only Asian person in the school or my class, right? And so you feel different. And then you feel like, well, why is it? Or why is it my parents, or why is it that, and this might be stereotyping, but everyone eats sandwiches and I eat rice every day, Yeah.
Do your parents speak English?
Oh yeah, my parents can speak English, but you can tell that they have an accent. You can tell that, like my dad, the difference between my mom and dad is my mom, she can think in English. My dad, he doesn't think in English. That means he translates it, right? And so, sometimes if you ever learn a new language, they say once you start dreaming in that language, you're pretty efficient with it, right? Once you can dream in it, you're pretty efficient. And so my mom can think in English, so she's pretty more fluent, right? My dad, I think he struggles more with it. And I don't know if he thinks in English, but he probably thinks in Vietnamese and then just translates it, right? My grandparents do not speak English at all. And so I grew up, you have to speak Vietnamese to your grandparents, right? And so, the identity crisis, right? And so at some parts of your life, I identify more as American, sometimes I identify more as Vietnamese. It was only later in life, and so when I went away for college, I went to the University of Illinois at Chicago. And sometimes people ask me, why did you go there? I said, to get away from home. It's purely it. I mean, my uncles went to KU, and it would have been cheaper to just go right there. It's close. I know this is probably a K-State area, but yeah, I probably should have just went there, been cheaper, but it was to get away from home. And one of the things I think I had in mind was that when I left home, I wasn't expecting to come back home, right? And so, in my college career, I met this priest, I got to know him, I started discerning the priesthood, and then after college, then I was going to go to seminary. And to go into seminary, you have to decide what diocese you study for, right? My home diocese, which is this diocese, would be Archdiocese of Kansas City in Kansas. But I started studying for the Archdiocese of Chicago, out there. And people ask me why. Well, it was purely probably because I didn't want to go home. So after my first year, and so there's a Vietnamese community in Chicago, a Vietnamese Catholic community in Chicago. So I knew, like, okay, so after that first year, you know, you take a summer assignment, right? So you can do different things. And so I asked them, can you send me to Vietnam? Because I can speak, but I can understand better. I can speak, but I can speak enough to get by. But I never learned how to read and write, right? So I was illiterate in Vietnamese. And so I asked me if you can send me for the summer to go to Vietnam to learn, to study Vietnamese. And so they did. They let me go over there. And they sponsored me to do that. And that's the thing that changed everything for me. Because when I got to Vietnam, and I went by myself, and so when I got to Vietnam, it felt like home. But I'd never been there before. It felt like home. And the reason why it felt like home is like, you know, the sounds, the smells, the food, the people, it felt like home. Everything about it felt like home. And it really opened my eyes. It was a moment where it opened my eyes to understanding my parents differently, and it helped me open my eyes to understand my upbringing much differently. Because, you know, as a kid, maybe as a kid or just being in one place, that's all you know. But here, like, just open it up. It's like, oh, this is why my parents raised me this way. Or, oh, this is why my parents are the way they are. And it probably opened my heart to that, right? So I probably, growing up, I just didn't like it, I didn't understand, that's why I didn't want to go home. I kind of had a hardened heart to it. But I think going to Vietnam kind of opened my heart to, like, okay, now let's go home. And so that's why I decided to come back to this diocese and study for it. And so that was kind of the beginning journey of, like, understanding, okay, who am I, right? And I think that's a question we continue to ask ourselves, whether it is first generation born here in America, or I think all of us. It's a fundamental question. I remember a teacher in high school told me there's two fundamental questions you ask yourself throughout your whole life, and you'll have different answers. And it says, who am I? Your identity, and then what am I here to do? Right? Your mission, right? And sometimes in our lives, we try to find out who we are by what we do, right? I think that's the trap of our world. It's like, you find yourself by what you do. Like, if I were to ask you, you know, who are you? You would probably say, well, you know, I'm a nurse, or I'm a carpenter, or I'm a farmer. But that's not really who you are, right? That's what you do. And so here was the question, here was my search of, like, who am I? And my question to myself purely was, am I Vietnamese or American? And that was to continue a question I asked myself for the next, like, 4 years. And it wasn't until I went to the Holy Land. I was fortunate to go to the Holy Land in Jerusalem, and I met this Vietnamese priest there. And he, after the fall of Saigon, he was kicked out of the country. And so him and another bishop was kicked out of the country. And so they landed in Rome. Actually, they were in prison for he was in prison for 9 years. The other a bishop was in prison for 13 years. And then after they were released, they were kicked out of the country. Okay? I should have brought the poem because he gave me this poem that he wrote in prison. But he was a biblical scholar. So I don't know, you probably don't know many biblical scholars, I don't either. But biblical scholars are interesting because they know like 5 languages fluently, and then another like 4 only in reading or writing. So they're skilled with linguistics. So here was a priest who were probably my grandparents, older than my parents, but part of my grandparents' generation, who can speak English fluently. And so I never were able to feel like I could express myself fluently with my grandparents, or even with my parents at times, right? There was always somewhat of a language barrier. And so here was a time where I could speak with this priest, Vietnamese priest. And so one of the things I asked him was that question that was on my heart and my mind was, you know, I always have this question of who am I? Am I Vietnamese or am I American? And the thing he told me was actually, it was so simple, but it kind of changed everything for me. He says, you don't find your identity in that. He says you find your identity in Christ. And so whatever faith you are, well, I find my identity in my God, right? My Creator. And that changed everything. Because then he, you know, you're not grasping at other things. And so, at that moment, it kind of released things for me. That then I was able to just kind of be myself of who I am. I've come to acknowledge that I'm a Vietnamese American. I mean, like, how simple is that, you know? I'm a Vietnamese American. Just like some of you guys here are German American or Irish American. Yeah.
When you grew up in Kansas City, was it a Vietnamese community you kind of grew up in, or was it all nationalities? Or? Yeah, so in Kansas City, so that Vietnamese community, that Vietnamese Catholic Church on the Missouri side, we all live kind of on that kind of Kansas City metro area. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah. Mm-hmm. So for me, my family was influenced, they understood the persecution of Catholics from the Communist Party. And then they left Vietnam with nothing but their family and their faith in God, right? And it was through my family's experience and suffering, but also the grace of different people, different American citizens, other organizations that helped them along the way, that we got to this point. And you know, one of the beautiful things that I've experienced, and actually, so my name, right? I go by Father Viet, but my first name is not just Viet; it's hyphenated. We use hyphens a lot to make a meaning of a name. So my first name is Viet, Viet. And it's Q-U-O-C hyphen V-I-E-T. And it has accent marks there. Quoc means the land of, or to mean the country of, in the Viet referring to Vietnam. So my name means the land of Vietnam, or the country of Vietnam. So there was no running away from who I am. And you know, as a little kid, I didn't know much about the Vietnam War, but I knew it was an unpopular war, right? And so I always thought Americans would look at me and see the horrors of the war. And so I was always afraid of that, right? But you know, as I've grown up and I've met different veterans, I'm looking at you, I'm thinking of vet. Veterans, there we go. As I met different veterans, they had no animosity towards me or my family. They're actually very sorry for what happened, right? And so as the more and more I meet veterans, and the more I've talked to them, you know, there's a healing process to that, I think. That's great.
and they actually thought that I would look at them as what happened in Vietnam, right? Or my family will look at them as what happened in Vietnam. And so we both had this thought of what it would look like, right? But I think it's a situation that it was a terrible situation. But in the end, and I think there is hope of seeing, at least I've been told from different veterans, and like seeing your family, seeing where you are today, gives me hope that something good came out of this situation, right? And then for me, for my family, we look at the different situations of the world today. So there are Syrian refugees, there's Ukrainian refugees, there's Afghan refugees, right? And so there's all those refugees. And this is where I think that whole identity comes from, right? And it's like, okay, I'm not Vietnamese or American, but in some ways I'm a child of God. And if we can look at a situation like this for the Vietnam War, we'll look at also as in refugee situations. They're just a child of God. And how can we help them? And right, so that's kind of how I looked at it and my experience with that. And a little glimpse into my family and where we come from. And also a little glimpse of who I am, being new here in Onega. And kind of get a glimpse of where my faith came from. My faith kind of comes from the sufferings of Vietnam, my family holding on to that faith, but also God's grace and all of that to transform that. And that's kind of where my faith comes from and what I would like you guys to understand. So now I'll kind of just open up to a little different questions or comments that you guys had. Yes?
The boat that your grandfather built, where did he build it, and how big was this boat if it held over 40 people?
Well, it's not 40 people comfortably. It's not 40 people comfortably. I mean, they were probably stacked on each other. I mean, it's a fishing boat. That's what it was. It's a fishing boat. And so it was probably maybe, from that door to this wall. But I mean, it's long, but it's not very big, right? And so, I mean, that's what he did as work, though. So they live on the coast, and he built boats. And
so once they loaded onto the American ship, did these boats
you just let it go.
Just let it go?
Yeah. So I mean, there's famous images of helicopters landing on like a battleship, and then they're pushing the helicopter off because another one has to come on, right? So at that time, it was so much chaos. You get to something and you let go of the other thing. You just destroy it in some ways. And so those boats would not last out in the big seas of the ocean. And so it's getting on an American ship and then you kind of sink it. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so once your family got to Kansas City, I assume they had to go find jobs. What did they do when they got there?
So at that time, so my parents were, so they went to school. My grandparents, they worked in the factories, right? And so I know now, like, there's a big Burmese community from Burma in the Kansas City area, and a lot of them work at the meat packing industry in like St. Joseph's. So I mean, yeah, you can kind of find work like that. So my grandfather on my dad's side worked in the factory for most of his life. My grandfather on my mom's side, I know growing up, he ended up getting a job as, since he's a specialized work, he restored antiques. And so that's a very skilled work that he can do, and so he did that. He restored antiques.
Father, how many Vietnamese left and came over here?
I think at that time it was like about 1 million.
Has any gone back?
Has any gone back? Like to live?
Yes.
I don't think so. No. So with Vietnam today, no, so here's a story of my dad. So my dad is one of 10. He's number 3 of the 10. Number 2, my uncle, he's actually a Catholic priest as well. But he's in Taiwan, so the islands of Taiwan. And so when he got ordained a priest, my dad and my grandmother and my uncle went to Vietnam, to their hometown, to kind of celebrate a massive Thanksgiving. But my dad hated it. When he went to Vietnam, he hated it. And one thing he said is, it's not the country I love. Right? It's not the country I love. One thing is, I never thought about this until he told me, is language develops, it changes. So think about the kids speaking today. You don't understand what they're talking about, right? They use slang words.
So it's the same as here.
Right, it's the same as here, right? Now imagine you growing up and your parents thinking, you guys talk too fast, this and that, right? So language develops. So the Vietnamese who left in 1975, their language never really developed. I mean, it didn't really change. So there's like a 1975 Vietnamese. But when you go back to Vietnam, it kind of changes a little bit, right? Even though, so, like my dad told me, right when he speaks, people know that he's one of the Vietnamese who left. All right. And so then, in the 90s and the 80s, again, Communist Party, there's a lot of, money speaks, and then there's a lot of corruption. And so especially, there's, they will give the Vietnamese who left a hard time at the airport with their passport. Unless you put like a $20 bill in that, they'll stamp it and let you go through. If not, they'll just sit there and let you wait, right? Little things like that. So they'll kind of make it hard on the Vietnamese who left to do anything in Vietnam, right? That has changed now, because they kind of realize capitalism is kind of good for the country and things like that.
Father, when you were there, you said about a summer or a year or
I was able to go there twice. So in 2013, I went there for the first time by myself for about 2.5 months studying. And then 2015, I went there with my parents, and that was the first time my mom went back since she left. Right.
Did they treat you different since it would be the communists in control now, right?
Yeah, it's still a Communist Party.
Were you ever worried about not being able to leave?
No, because it's something to be American citizen. And that's the truth. If you're an American citizen, people kind of leave you alone in that sense.
Kind of like you have a big brother at home.
Kind of, yeah. No, there was no fear of that for me, not in Vietnam. Since we have American passports, I think that's a big thing, right? Now, what does the church look like in Vietnam today? It kind of looks like it's flourishing, but as I talk to different priests and seminaries, they say, oh, it's very, again, the Communist Party has a hold on it, right? If you talk anything against the Communist Party, they'll make you disappear, type thing. They'll still do stuff like that. And so, it's almost like, don't get me wrong, they're still a Communist Party, right? Yes?
Did your parents and grandparents ever become American citizens?
Yeah, there was pictures of my grandparents the day of their citizenship, little American flags and stuff like that. So it's kind of neat, yeah.
How long did it take them to get their citizenship?
It took, when I was at least like 20 years. Well, and then some just didn't do it right away. Because there's an uncle of mine who was like a kid, but he didn't get his citizenship until like 15 years ago. And so sometimes, I don't know, people...
So they weren't working to become citizens for 20 years?
I don't know. To tell you the truth, I'm unsure.
Well, because I know a guy from Romania, and he tried to get citizenship, and it took him 8 years of paperwork to get it. So.
Yeah, there's a lot of... It's a complicated process.
Yeah.
But no, all my family, yeah, my grandparents all became American citizens, right? Yes. And that's one of the reasons why too also, because they couldn't leave the United States unless they become a citizen. You know, if they want to go back to Vietnam. Again, to have that American passport is an important thing. And so.
You know, I think we're all families of immigrants or refugees.
Right.
And I wonder when they started requiring that you had to go to school and do that to become an American citizen, because I know my ancestors didn't.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting that your family had to go through that process, or the people that come in now have to go through that process, I guess. Anybody know?
My son-in-law is from Venezuela, and it took quite a few years for him to become an American citizen.
Because
that's like 5 years, I think.
That's
he had to be sponsored for so long, and then he did all the paperwork. And it actually was very expensive for him. Venezuela required that. He is no longer allowed to go back to Venezuela, and he has family there. And he can't go back because they will not let him come back to America if he does. So, yeah.
Do you have any brothers and sisters?
Yes. So I'm the youngest of 3 boys. So I'm the youngest of 3 boys. My middle brother lives in Kansas City area with his wife, and they have 2 daughters, a 7-year-old and a 2-year-old, and I have an oldest brother who lives in San Francisco. Right. Yes?
You talked about wanting to leave Kansas City. That's the reason you went to Chicago. What was so awful that you wanted to leave? What was
It's not that it's awful. Again, it's not exterior. This is what I realized. A lot of struggles in life, it's not so much exterior, but it's interior. Right? It's almost like I'm thinking if I change the exterior, the interior would change with it, right? It was like you just bring that along with you. So it's until you kind of resolve that interior struggle that then any place can really be at home, right? I think it's a common story though, but like kids have to leave home to then appreciate home, right?
I was wondering why Chicago?
Oh, why Chicago? Well, let's see. My brother went to Dallas, and that's 8 hours away from Kansas City. So it's like a good day trip. You can make it. And so in my mind, it was like, all right, so an 8-hour radius around Kansas City. And Chicago fit that 8-hour radius. And so,
Well, that would have been my last choice.
yeah. So now Chicago.
Father, I have a question.
Sure.
When you first came, your dad came he was a deacon.
Right.
How much does his influence spill over on you?
How much?
The fact that was he a deacon before or after you became a priest?
Okay, so this is what Dave's asking me is, so my dad is a permanent deacon for different dioceses and different bishops, right? And so he asked me how much of the influence of my dad was on me. And actually, it was actually the opposite. Because my dad was ordained a deacon 2 weeks before I was ordained a priest. And so I was actually in the seminary for a year then before he entered into diaconate. And this is at least what he told me. You know, a lot of people saw him being very active in the church and thought that maybe he had a vocation to be a deacon. And so, you know, the priests in his church would ask him, other people would ask him, and he would say, no, I cannot, I won't do that. And then I guess when I told him I was going to seminary, it kind of hit him, and maybe in his own prayer life, he said, well, if my son can make a commitment like that and answer God's call, why can't I? And so that's what he told me. Yeah. That kind of influenced him to enter into the diaconate. But it's the influence of my parents' faith that definitely influenced me into the seminary. Yeah.
Speaking of which, so I assume your parents grew up Catholic, if they came over when they were very young. Did your grandparents also grow up Catholic?
Yep. Yep. So they grew up Catholic in the north of Vietnam. Yeah. Yes.
So maybe you said this, Father, but the state of religious tolerance now in Vietnam, like priests were in clerics. I mean, openly they can show that they're a priest and they're a Catholic priest, and there's a tension, or they have to be guarded at certain times.
No, it is exteriorly looks open, right? But like on your driver's license, it has to. If you're a Catholic, it says Catholic on there. Like, whether you're a priest or just they mark it very clearly, you know, things like that. Like on your driver's license has a little mark that says you're a Catholic and things like that. So it's exteriorly, again, as tourists coming, it looks fine. But if you live there long enough, they say, no, there's still like a hold of suppression on the people, definitely. Yeah.
Are there other Christian denominations in Vietnam?
There are, not very big. Yeah, not very big.
And the majority of people, do they practice, or they just?
So, the religion of that country was Buddhist. They're Buddhists because we're influenced by the Chinese, or they were just nothing, right? The Catholic population of that country is about 7% of the country is Catholic, maybe.
So they put Catholic on their driver's license, and they do it secret. I mean, they're Catholic, but they don't really say they are.
Who?
The people over there, because you said they get after the Catholics.
Right, so they were, I mean, yeah, if you're going to the church and stuff, I mean, they know that you're Catholic, and like you have to register as a Catholic.
That is government mandated.
Government mandated.
And they don't. They leave you alone as long as you
That's like
There's a reputation in the United States and dioceses that Vietnamese want to have their own parishes. I know back in California, where tenacity that people have, you know, the Vietnamese wanted to have their own control. Is that the case, and why not?
Well, I think with any immigrant culture that comes over here, you want to have your own. So I know like Chicago diocese, or even here, I mean, there are Irish churches, Irish Catholic churches, German Catholic churches, and they're like a block away from each other. You know, Ukrainian, you know, things like that. Because keeping them together, it helps them with their community and also their faith. Now, in California, there's just a big population of it's like outside of Vietnam, that's the biggest population of Vietnamese in the world is in California. And so, now, so yeah, if you're a big enough cultural community, then you're kind of, if you can support a church, then you would.
Why not the Filipinos? They don't seem to have the same, their own language or their own church. That seems to be the departure of that.
Yeah, I don't know about the Philippines is very Catholic. The country itself is very Catholic. But they mostly speak English. And I mean, there's Tagalog, their language, but they mostly speak English. Now, I don't know if they're, how they are within like the United States, like having separate communities like that. So, yeah, I'm not sure. Yes?
It makes me think of the Jews that have to wear the yellow star on their coat.
Oh, yeah.
And so, like, is that a fear that someday they will take over like Hitler did with the Jews? I don't know if that.
Like, so she said it kind of reminds her of like, you know, if you're a Jew, you have to wear the Star of David, right? Well, it is. It's a way of separating you from the other, and then and it's a way of persecuting you, right?
So you're talking about like Vietnamese and Vietnamese Catholics in the Communist Party. Yeah. I mean, it's a way to put them down. And
I would be scared to stay there, that would happen to me, what happened to the Jews, if they was.
yeah.
That would be scary.
Yeah, I mean, if anything happens, again, you know, stay in that country, your land doesn't belong to you. So if it's kind of like eminent domain here in this country, if they want to, they can just take you out of your house. If the government wanted to, they can take your land and just kick you out if they want to. And so, but that's just with communist countries anyways, so.
Father, we're going to probably wind up a little bit. I asked you to do this one other time. Can you say Our Father in Vietnamese? Maybe some others.
Okay. All right, so here's Our Father in Vietnamese. Nên cha và con là thánh thần, amen. Lại cha chúng con ở trên trời, chúng con nguyện xin cha cả sáng, nước cha chỉ đến, ý cha để hiện sự đất của như trên trời. Xin cha cho chúng con hôm nay nên thường hàng ngày, và tha nợ chúng con như chúng con cũng tha các con nợ chúng con. Xin chớ để chúng con xa trước cám dỗ, nhưng cứu chúng con cho khỏi sự dữ. Amen. Nên cha và con và thánh thần. Amen.
Okay, that winds up our program, and you're welcome to stay around and ask some questions. And please go out and have some refreshments. And then if you want to go visit the rest of the museum, it's open. All right, just help. Thank you.